Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today we're going to be looking at ad hominem fallacies. In the comments, Pick Up Your Pants Patrol requested that I do a video on this and the overuse of the Dunning-Kruger effect. So first, thank you for the request. Second, I'll be talking about the overuse of the Dunning-Kruger effect in a separate video, as it's not a small topic. And third, I'll link to some other videos I found talking about ad hominem fallacies, both because they're funny and because they will almost certainly be less long-winded than me. As you may know, ad hominem means to the man, and refers to arguing against somebody else's argument by attacking the man rather than his argument. It has the form, your conclusion is false because you are defective. Now, this is an informal fallacy, not a formal fallacy. So, for example, it would not be fallacious if the other man being not defective was a premise in his argument. For example, if he made the classic, I did that as a kid and I turned out okay argument, if the man did not turn out okay, this does in fact vitiate his argument. So, right away, we can see it is not legitimate to call something an ad hominem fallacy if the virtue of the person making the original argument was in fact part of that argument. And this happens more than you may think. For example, a person who claims that two positions are not contradictory because he personally holds both is implicitly relying on his intellectual competence and integrity as part of his argument. Now, an important point to note is that since an ad hominem fallacy is a type of argument, it can only be a fallacy in an argument. To give a simple analogy, it is only against the rules of soccer for a non-goalie to intentionally touch a soccer ball with his hands in a soccer game. If a man intentionally touches a soccer ball with his hands while selling soccer balls in a sports equipment store, no one is entitled to a penalty kick. If a person has not made an argument, they cannot have made a bad argument. For example, answering the question, how can somebody have said something so stupid, is not making an argument as to why the person was wrong, so it cannot be an ad hominem fallacy. It might be rude or presumptuous or hubristic or just not cricket, but it is inherently impossible for it to be an ad hominem fallacy. The problem comes in that there are many human activities which look like an argument, or even more so activities where you can argue that there is an implicit argument being made. So, for example, very few people have the luxury of being able to hold long discussions with everyone they talk to about every point that others might want to bring up. It is, therefore, necessary to not answer people some of the time. And since people tend to choose how to spend their time on the basis of what will have the most value, to them, if not to everyone, it is common to take such decisions as claims about the merits of the arguments one chose not to address. This is not completely invalid, but it is fraught with peril as people have all sorts of private reasons for what they do that the rest of us are not privy to. Still, one of the assumptions which we generally hold is that if a person has proof that one is wrong, then it is more worth addressing than if they're merely telling you something about themselves. However, there is a practical problem which arises, because all sorts of things are claimed in this world which are not true, and the only way to tell whether an argument really does prove that one is wrong is to examine it carefully. So we are back to where we started, that for purely practical reasons, some of these claims will simply have to be left unexamined. Which to leave unexamined? Here is where one's judgment of the person making the argument becomes critical. If somebody I know to be knowledgeable and a careful thinker says he thinks I'm wrong, then I really should take the time to hear him out. If an obviously ignorant, manifest fool says that I'm wrong, it would be absurd to take time from worthwhile things to hear him out, despite the fact that he might be right, even if just by accident. Obviously, things like familial relationships or being paid to teach someone can change the calculation, which is why some fools do learn, but in general, this is how all people operate, and so it is how they expect all others to operate as well. And this is why so many people mistake insults for ad hominem arguments. Or rather, this is almost why. One of the ways to tell a fool from a wise man is that a fool says and does foolish things, whereas the wise man says and does wise things. Shocking, I know. But it does follow that if a person wants to defend dismissing a person without hearing them out, citing something foolish they said or did does lend credence that they are using their time well, as opposed to running away from a legitimate challenge. It's a heuristic, not an argument, And it gets very iffy when the foolish things are not directly related to the subject matter at hand. If a person says something catastrophically foolish, like that science is the only way to get knowledge, you're on very safe grounds dismissing everything that they have to say about epistemology, or philosophy more generally. However, this would not be ground for dismissing what they have to say about bricklaying, because people compartmentalize. The reverse is also true. A man who says something very foolish about bricklaying may still know quite a lot about epistemology. But not everyone makes this distinction, and people will dismiss others upon poor grounds. And when they do this, it is not uncommon to hear it called an ad hominem, and not unreasonably so. I won't listen to him because he exercised terrible judgment with a banana one time is not really a commentary on the man's judgment outside of the circumstances in which he did the strange act. It might justly make us suspicious that he put himself in such circumstances when he wasn't in them, but it's a complicated world, and it's not really possible to know, so refusing to listen to what he has to say about very different subjects on those grounds alone would not be specially good judgment on the part of the person refusing, and it would show some of the same sort of characteristic error as an ad hominem fallacy in an argument. So, I think the metaphor is reasonable enough, if not normally articulated well. Unfortunately, there are people who can't handle complexity, and grasping this much, they then make the leap to every justification given for spending one's time better being this sort of error. The result is that they end up throwing the words ad hominem around like they're playing a game of hot potato with them. Amusingly, such people will also generally not realize that they're using the term ad hominem metaphorically, so they will sometimes include the word fallacy when criticizing something which isn't even an argument. So for example, if one declines to hear out a drunkard, this might be called an ad hominem fallacy when one wasn't making any sort of argument about the truth of what the drunkard said, and worse, being a drunkard is very relevant to whether such a person is likely to say things worth listening to, not so much because of their poor judgment in becoming a slave to alcohol, but because alcohol is a mind-altering substance which is known to make people bad at thinking. The odds that a man who spent most of his waking hours drunk has done a good job of thinking are, therefore, very slim indeed. And this mistake, if made frequently enough, can condition people to think of every criticism of a person as an ad hominem error. I think that works synergistically with criticizing a person not being the done thing at tea parties, and more than a few people, tired of the conflict inherent in a pluralistic society, want all of life conducted under the rules of tea parties. And having a label with a negative connotation really helps when criticizing something upon manifestly weak grounds. And then there's the problem that many people are just poorly educated and sloppy in their thinking. They pick up the words ad hominem by seeing how they're used and conclude that the usage is that you can throw the charge of ad hominem anytime someone says something which isn't nice about someone else. So when we hear the charge of ad hominem thrown around on the internet, what is it typically? In all of the discussion and disputation I've seen over the years, genuine ad hominem fallacies tend to be quite rare. First, because arguments of any sort, good or bad, tend to be rare compared to mere assertion. Second, because ad hominem fallacies very rarely look like a decent argument. Daniel Dennet is ugly, therefore free will is real, just sounds like a non sequitur. Which it is, non sequitur is the Latin for it does not follow. And there's no variant of that which sounds close to valid. Daniel Dennet knew so little about people he coined the term bright and thought it had a chance. He also says that there's no such thing as free will, therefore free will is real. It is still an obvious non sequitur. I'm not saying that ad hominem fallacies are never made, only that in practice they're one of the less popular logical fallacies. Affirming the consequent, by contrast, is far more popular. Some people even approvingly call it the scientific method. Anyway, there's very little in logical argumentation which isn't an ad hominem fallacy, but looks like an ad hominem fallacy. So charges of ad hominem don't seem to get thrown around a lot in response to actual logical argumentation. The analogous use of ad hominem, which is really just a matter of prudential judgment, is more common, though still not very common. Most people have the sense to keep discussions of matters of prudential judgment between themselves and friends, while actual citations are not overly common. And these days with Google, it's easy enough to answer a citation by citing a putative rebuttal rather than by outright dismissal. Probably most of the use of ad hominem I've seen, especially on the internet, is using it as a warding spell, to try to protect the one speaking the magic words from the other person's point. I doubt that this happens much with people with whom it is possible to have a serious discussion, but every now and then you can get past it by saying, I'm not saying that his conclusion is false, only that you need a better source for me to consider spending the time reading it, or at the very least a reliable source who vouches for this one. This is also why disputation works much better in person, with people we've known for years. Where everyone knows each other, they're much better able to understand each other and know what sort of mistakes the other person rarely or never makes. I don't mean that conversation over the internet never works. It obviously does work sometimes. Just that it's got a huge hurdle it has to overcome, which real-life conversations don't. That's all for now. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.